Welcome to the latest Points to Ponder. This week I'm talking about Chapter 9, the focus of which is responsible enterprise excellence. So we're looking at operations. Okay. First, to start things out, I want to do a quick refresh on open systems theory. So please recall that when we talk about an open system, we are talking about something that has three components. First, inputs. This is everything that comes into the system. For example, raw materials, people, information, money, etc., all inputs. Then those inputs are transformed through a variety of processes, okay, so that's the second piece, into outputs. Okay, that's what goes out to the external environment. Those outputs include products, services, knowledge, waste, everything that is a function of the transformation of the inputs through all of the different organizations' processes into those outputs. Okay? And with open systems theory, we are assuming that the organization interacts openly with its environment. Its environment is the source of inputs. Its environment is where we send our outputs. Now, the real focus of this chapter is on the process part of open systems theory. In other words, the transformation piece. And that's where we're going to be focusing our interests. Okay, so what is a process? As it's defined for you in the text, it's any activity or set of activities that uses resources, okay, to transform, to change, to process inputs into outputs. Now, we're really interested in two things here. The first is effectiveness, and that is defined for you as the extent to which planned activities are realized and planned results achieved. In other words, do we actually accomplish the goals that we set? When we do that, we say we're being effective. Efficiency, on the other hand, is the relationship between the result achieved and the resources used. So it's really the ratio of outcomes or outputs to inputs. Okay? So are we able to show a good return, outcome, output, on what we've input into the process? That's efficiency. All right, this chapter looks more complicated than it actually is. This chapter is really talking about three things. Pretty straightforward. So the first major part of the chapter, phase 1, is focused on describing processes or analyzing processes. The second phase, or the second part of the chapter, really talks about, okay, so we've got all these processes. What does it take to maximize their efficiency? And then the third part, or phase 3, of the chapter is focused on how do we make sure that we're effective. Okay, so first is, well, what are the processes that we have? You know, what are we doing in this organization in order to transform inputs into outputs? Okay, so what is it that we're doing? Who's involved? What are all the steps? What are all the costs, etc., etc. Okay, that's all understanding, describing, analyzing their processes. Then we're going to focus on, well, you know, are we really using our inputs to maximize our outputs? In other words, are we being as efficient as we possibly can? Followed by, are we making sure that we're actually doing the stuff that we want to be doing? That's the effectiveness piece. Okay, so again, it's much simpler than it appears. So let's start with phase 1. Okay, this is all about describing, analyzing the processes so that we know what we're actually doing. Okay, a lot of times in organizations, people imagine that they know what we're doing. They think they do until they really start to dig in and they start mapping all of the various processes that the organization uses to accomplish its goals. And of course, as you might imagine, this is increasingly complicated and complex as the organization increases in size. But no matter what, even with very small organizations, in order to try and make our enterprise more efficient and more effective, it starts by knowing, well, what are we really doing? So we do that through a variety of mechanisms, essentially describing all of our processes using what your text calls process detail maps. The more old-fashioned term is flowcharts. Basically, we're just trying to understand how activities in any given process are related. Okay, how do they fit together? How are they sequenced? Okay, are they chronological? Are they parallel? And then how is the flow of the process controlled? We then go ahead and describe all of those processes through procedure documents. Okay, so a procedure is basically, it's just a specific way to carry out a process. And when we talk about procedure documents, what most of us think of are things like, is there a manual that tells us how to do what we're doing? Are there SOPs or standardized operating procedures? Are there checklists and so on? So again, the first phase is just figuring out what we're doing. Okay, lots of figures associated with this, figures 9.2 all the way through 9.8. But really, it all boils down to simply knowing what we're doing. The second phase, again, as I mentioned earlier, is focused on efficiency. And here, the goal is to do so through lean enterprise methods. So you're given a bunch of terminology to start, eco-efficiency, for example, where our aim is to minimize the environmental resource consumption and ecological damage by trying to optimize the efficiency of our firm's production processes. Now, this way of thinking is not limited to a manufacturing setting. It can also apply to a service setting. It can apply to an educational setting. It can apply to any setting, okay? Any organizational setting. So just because you see the word production, please don't assume that that means manufacturing. More specifically, lean enterprise methods are focused on the efficient and effective use of resources through a lens that regards resources used for any objective other than value creation for the end consumer or the end customer or for key stakeholders as waste. Okay? That's a pretty brutal way of thinking about things, but essentially if whatever we're doing in any given moment isn't delivering value to our end user consumers or our key stakeholders, it's wasteful. And the goal of using lean enterprise methods is to reduce and eliminate waste to the greatest extent possible. When we talk about value, we're talking about basically anything that a key stakeholder or customer or consumer, pick your word, is willing to pay for. If someone's willing to pay for it, knowledgeable about and willing to pay for it, then we're talking about something that has value. And waste is anything that doesn't lead to value added, okay? Anything at all in the process, from the input through the process through the output stage. Table 9.2 in your text does a really nice job of succinctly summarizing some core principles and core processes associated with lean enterprise, and I would encourage you to take a careful look at those. And this is the sort of thing that you want to work with a team to make sure that people really understand what they're getting into. Now, lean, this use of the word lean and lean enterprise methods, I got to tell you, this is very hip. It's very of the moment. Lots of people talking about this. They'll use the terminology sort of weirdly, like we need to try and lean out our organization. But essentially, just keep in mind, very simply, what we're trying to do is to identify sources of and reduce and, if possible, eliminate waste. One of the most well-known of these methodologies is the Toyota production system. And in fact, there is lots that you could read on the Toyota production system. And I think it is, in many respects, a very good model, but it's certainly not the only model that you might use to try and identify waste within an organization, within an enterprise, and try to reduce and or eliminate that. Now, within the Toyota production system, it has its own jargon, of course, because how else do we make money on something if we don't give it its own jargon? And so you'll see the three categories of waste that are defined for you in our text: muda, muri, and mura. And then you've got synonyms associated with each of these. So muda, for example, is anything that's useless or superfluous. Muri is anything that's unreasonable or impossible or more difficult than it needs to be. And mura is anything where we're introducing irregularity or non-uniformity or inequality. Table 9.3 does a very nice job of capturing some of the different kinds of muda waste, and it works into this lovely thing called now time. So you can see different kinds of waste, for example, non-quality or defects, overproduction, when we're making much more than we actually need. Certainly there was a time in industry where this was the norm. In the United States, for example, we had lots of space for warehousing, and warehouses may have been inexpensive, and so lots of manufacturing facilities would just, produce at a rate without any attention to the extent to which the customer actually required the product or how many of the product. And so those things would just sit in overproduction facilities or warehouses. Waiting is a form of waste. Transportation, every time we have to move something, there's waste involved. Inventory, again, whether we're talking about as raw materials, work in process, finished goods, all of that is money that we've spent that's sitting, that's not making its way into the customer's hands. It's not producing value on the spot. Motion, and then the last, excess processing, where we're over delivering, going past what the customer or the stakeholder wants, needs, has any use for, is willing to pay for, etc. All right, so that was phase 2. So phase 1, learn the process, understand exactly what we're really doing. Phase 2, figure out how to maximize efficiency, how to minimize cost outlays relative to the value associated with the outputs. Okay, remember, it's outputs to inputs. That's how we measure efficiency. And now we're on to phase 3. As I said, this is actually a fairly straightforward chapter. And phase 3 is focused on effectiveness. Now, probably the best way to think about effectiveness is to think about our good old friend total quality management or quality management. And this is one of the things that I included for you this week on our D2L site, is something that talks about W. Edwards Deming work. Very important work. If you're not at least somewhat familiar with it, please read that material. Please familiarize yourself with Deming's concept of quality. It is as relevant today as it was when he introduced it many decades ago, and it will help you to really think about effectiveness, going beyond efficiency, going beyond lean, and really thinking about effectiveness. Are we accomplishing the goals that we need to be accomplishing? Are we delivering the value that our key stakeholders really want and need? So we talk about stakeholder effectiveness. This is creating outcomes that actually satisfy stakeholder requirements. And remember, stakeholders, it's not just shareholders. Stakeholders are everybody: employees, consumers, suppliers, government agencies, even the competition, the communities in which our organizations reside. I mean, I could go on and on. Each organization identifies its stakeholders differently, right? So we need to know what it is what are their requirements? What do they want? Total responsibility management translates TQM, or total quality management tools and practices, to the field of responsibility management, which is what we're focused on. Quality management, or total quality management, doesn't matter, continuous improvement, continuous quality improvement, they're all the same thing, is a framework that aims at creating products and services that are ideally perfectly aligned with stakeholder needs by trying to reduce nonconformities with customer requirements. Now, a starting point for everything that is quality management, and there was a time when I taught a course in this, the starting point is always the customer or the consumer or the stakeholder. Pick your word. It doesn't really matter. Basically, the people who we exist for, the people for whom our organization exists. And keep in mind, we're talking about employees, we're talking about clients, customers, suppliers, etc., etc. So there are all different kinds of mechanisms that an organization might use to try and hear better the voice of its customers or the voice of its stakeholders, whether we're talking about surveys or focus groups, sort of traditional marketing research. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. The truth is, traditional marketing research is great once you have a product or service and you have something in mind and you want to find out, well, what do stakeholders think about this? But ultimately, really your best asset for determining what your stakeholders require will be your employee base. Those people are the key to your organization's success in every imaginable way. Their creativity and their willingness to innovate are key. So, for example, the classic story, you take something like the Apple iPod, and now, of course, many of us with our Apple iPhones. Customers did not tell Apple that, hey, I'd like this thing where I could put all of my music in one place and then I could carry it around, and that would be awesome. That's not how it worked. Apple engineers and Apple folks recognized that there was this desire for people to be able to transport their music, to have their music with them at all times if possible, and to have music not just from one album, but perhaps from many albums, many different artists, etc., etc. And so it was through a rather stringent set of internal exercises that Apple's engineers and others came up with the idea of the iPod, which was a leap ahead past albums, past cassettes, past CDs, allowing people to carry all their music in just a little thing. And basically it came down to understanding, well, what is it that our customers really want, and how could we deliver that in an innovative way? One of the models that I think it gets a pretty short coverage in your text, but I think it's really important. And you could use it, I don't care what your organization does. It's a beautiful model. It's Kano's customer needs model, and you'll see it in figure 9.11, where Kano talks about dissatisfiers, satisfiers, and delighters. Dissatisfiers are the characteristics or traits of a product or service that they're the must-haves. If they're not there, you will dissatisfy your customers. The easy example would be like an automobile, for example. In 2016, a dissatisfier is power brakes and power steering. It's hard to imagine a consumer vehicle that wouldn't have either of those. Certainly back in the 1960s, if you purchased an automobile, it was very possible that you were purchasing an automobile where the brakes were manual, etc. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just look it up on the web, and you can get a feel for what that must have been like, how different it was prior to having power steering and power brakes. So those are basic. Got to be there. Got to be there. Then there are the satisfiers, the things that make people happy, like great fuel efficiency will make people happy. It isn't the case yet where that has reached the stage of dissatisfier, but it will at some point. See, this is the inevitable outcome of this model. Things that at one point are satisfiers become dissatisfiers over time as consumers, as stakeholders become more accustomed to seeing those satisfiers. Those become now the minimum, the must-haves, the basics. And then there are the delighters, the things that go above and beyond. And at one point, for example, having heated seats in an automobile, that was a delighter. Oh wow, it's like, wow, what is this? I think it's becoming a satisfier, and I'm sure the day will come where that will just be, what? You don't have heated seats? How could you not have heated seats in your car? In other words, a dissatisfier. Now, you can take this model and apply it to your organization. For your key stakeholders, what are the dissatisfiers? The things that just have to be there, otherwise they're dissatisfied, they're unhappy. The things that satisfy them, things that make them happy, that they also expect, that makes them happy, and then the delighters, sort of the wow factor, the holy moly. I never would have thought that this is something that you would find in a higher educational institution, in a manufacturer, in a restaurant, etc., etc. The chapter goes on and uses some additional terminology that it's important for you to familiarize yourself with. The algorithm COPIS, C-O-P-I-S, basically the idea is to begin with the end in mind. So we begin by thinking about the customer, the end user stakeholder. What does that person want? Those are the outputs, so customer outputs. What are the processes that will yield those outputs? What inputs will we need in order for those processes to happen? And finally, what suppliers, with whom will we work in order to get the inputs we need? But again, it begins by thinking about the end. What is it that our customers want? The next important abbreviation is PDSA. Back in the early 1980s, this was PDCA. Okay, so it's Plan, Do, Study, Act. It used to be Plan, Do, Check, Act. Basically, this is a continuous cycle of improvement. So it starts by planning. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? We do it, we implement. As we implement, we study to see how are we doing, and then Based upon the study, based upon our checking, based upon our measurements, we make changes as necessary and we continue the cycle. Plan, do, study, act. And this is how we continuously improve everything we're doing. For breakthrough improvement, we might try doing something like using Six Sigma. Six Sigma was originated at Motorola. It's a fairly straightforward framework. This comes post Deming. Framework for process improvement. It's centered on the assessment of customer, again, stakeholder needs, and the elimination of process errors. So it's all about eliminating defects, minimizing the variation in the processes that we use. More often than not, you will see this used in manufacturing settings, but it can also be applied to service settings. Another way of maximizing our effectiveness, ensuring that we're satisfying our end user consumers, our customers, our stakeholders, is through best practices benchmarking. Basically looking wherever, everywhere to find, okay, what is the best way that this or that process is being done, whether it's internally in a given division or if it's externally in another organization. And going and studying that best practice, and then seeing, is there a way that we can adapt this best practice to our culture, to our context, to our stakeholders. Keep in mind what I just said. It isn't a simple matter of borrowing a process wholesale and simply adopting it. No, it's a matter of we observe, we study, we try to understand, and then we see, okay, can we adapt that to, again, our culture, our context, our stakeholders? And if the answer is yes, fantastic. Then we can improve what we're doing. Some of the things that enable, training, the soft stuff, training, communication, empowering our employees. Medium categories or medium enablers include setting SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound goals and objectives, controls, measures, etc. And then hard enablers, you got to have the actual resources, the tangible resources. Your text gives you a whole bunch of categories for benchmarking. For example, customer service performance, product or service performance, employee performance, supplier performance. Benchmarking has been happening now for decades. It's very common. So it won't be unusual if your organization reaches out to another organization and asks if it's possible to benchmark on a given process. Okay. The chapter ends by giving you a nice responsible operations management checklist, which I think, again, does a nice job of pulling the chapter together. 3 things. Phase 1, understand the process. So does our understanding of the process include where it is that we actually create environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits? How the processes that we have create and destroy value for our stakeholders? And then what about the ethical components of all of our processes? Phase 2 is focused on efficiency. Do our processes minimize economic, social, and environmental waste? Remember, that's what efficiency is all about. It's all about reducing and eliminating waste. Are we minimizing situations where stakeholder value is reduced? And finally, are we doing our best to minimize ethical dilemmas? And then the last phase is again focused on effectiveness. Do our processes optimize environmental, social, and economic value creation? Do they optimize value for all of our stakeholders through our processes? And finally, do our processes create moral excellence? This is, again, the bottom line, the triple bottom line, and that's a wrap for this chapter.